Hello, and welcome to the Art and Fiction Podcast. I'm Carol Cram, and today I'm doing something a little different. Instead of interviewing a fellow novelist, I'm going to chat with you about my new novel, The Choir. I've been wanting to do this episode for a while, partly because The Choir is one of the most personal novels I've written, and partly because the story behind the story is one that I really enjoy telling. So let's start with the novel itself. The choir is set in the 1890s in a fictional mill town in Yorkshire called Briarstown. It follows two women from working class backgrounds whose lives diverge dramatically, but then eventually are brought back together by their shared love of music. One woman, Eliza Kingwell, stays in the North. She has five daughters to care for, and she's trapped in a bad marriage. The other main character in the novel is Ruth Henton. Ruth was Eliza's childhood friend, and she's also the stepdaughter of Eliza's husband. When Ruth was a teenager, she had the opportunity to go to London, and now she is a star on the London stage. She, like Eliza, had a beautiful singing voice, but circumstances took her to the very pinnacle of achievement in the London theatre, whereas Eliza was left at home. So the novel revolves around the stories of these two women with very different lives, but both are shaped by music. But before I tell you more about the story, I want to tell you where it came from. The choir began not as a plot idea or a character, but with a family mystery. My grandmother, who was born in Yorkshire, used to refer somewhat enigmatically about the first and second families. Her grandmother, my great great grandmother, had six children with one man. She then left him, and a year later, she had a seventh child with another man, and she went on to have another six children with him. 13 kids in total. That's a lot of children. So my granny would talk about the first and second families, but she never elaborated. I didn't know the details until I looked up my family on Ancestry.com and found the names and birth records of all 13 children, six with one man and seven with another. Also, there was not much of a gap in between. That alone was interesting enough. But Granny also used to talk about her grandmother in, well, not particularly flattering terms. She actually called her the old battle axe. During World War I, Granny was sent to live with her grandmother in Yorkshire, and she used to say that the day she arrived was the day her grandmother fired the maid. So naturally, I've always wanted to know more about my great great grandmother. She sounded like a formidable woman, and I sensed there was more to the story than Granny knew, or at least what she told me. So for me, the central question that inspired the choir was how does a working class woman with six children in Victorian England leave her husband? There were no safety nets, no independent income, and no easy legal recourse. Abandoning a marriage wasn't just emotionally difficult, it was economically and socially perilous. Women who left their husbands faced poverty, social ostracism, and the very real possibility of losing their children. So, how did Eliza do it? That question sat in my mind for years. And then I came across an article about the extraordinary popularity of music competitions in Victorian England, particularly in the industrial north. Choral societies, brass bands, and competitive festivals were drawing participants from all across Yorkshire and Lancashire. Thousands of working people, including women, joined choirs and competed for cash prizes. When I learned about those cash prizes, I thought, that's it. By entering a music competition, Eliza could get the money she needed to leave her husband and start a new life. Those two seeds, a family mystery and a musical craze, became the choir. I have to talk here for a moment about my mom, because this novel is also personal in another way. My mom helped me with some of the research before she passed. She was truly a lifelong learner, the kind of person who got excited about dusty historical details, and she would have loved to see this book finally come to life. Her mother, my granny, wasn't as fortunate when it came to education. Granny used to tell me that when she was 14, she had the chance to go to the local grammar school in England and become a teacher. She didn't go because she didn't want to be with the mill owner's daughters. She was working class and didn't feel comfortable, as she put it, getting above herself. So at 14, she went to work at a laundry, and at 16, she came to Canada. Granny's reluctance to rise above her class affected her all her life. Class got in Granny's way, just as it does for the women in the choir. One of my deepest motivations for writing this novel was to honor the working class women who shaped my own family and whose stories are so often missing from the historical record. To help me research the choir, I of course traveled to England. I visited Quarry Bank Mill in Cheshire, one of Britain's best preserved cotton mills from the 19th century. One of the attendants turned on the looms so I could hear what they sounded like. Oh my goodness, it was deafening. The machines clattered and crashed so violently, the conversation was impossible. I couldn't imagine spending 12, even 14 hours a day in all of that noise. But that is exactly what Eliza and millions like her did. My great grandmother started work in the mill when she was only 11. In the novel, keeping her daughters out of the mill becomes one of Eliza's prime motivations for wanting to leave her husband and Briarstown. I also visited the Birmingham Back-to-Backs, which are run by the National Trust. If you visited England, you know that the vast majority of National Trust properties are palaces and castles. Basically, they are where the 1% lived. Where did the other 99% live? Well, the vast majority of them, particularly in the 19th century in the industrial north, lived in what were called back-to-backs. These were cramped, terraced houses that were cheaply built. They shared walls on three sides. Some of the houses looked inwards to a courtyard, other houses looked outwards to the street. The National Trust preserved one whole, what they called court of back-to-backs in Birmingham, and of course, I went to visit it. I highly recommend going if you are ever in the area. On the tour, the guide will lead you up and down numerous staircases as you go from house to house in the court. Back in the day, there were no handrails on the staircases, and many people, particularly women who had long skirts, fell to their deaths. Even clinging to the handrails that have now been installed, I could barely make it up some of those twisting staircases. I couldn't even imagine how my Eliza would make it up and down those staircases every day, often with a baby in her arms. A typical back-to-back was 3 stories, with each story being one room. So the ground floor was where the family lived and ate. The second floor was usually where mom and dad slept, and often a lodger and the youngest children, and the rest of the children would sleep in the attic. The rooms are tiny, the walls were very thin. It must have been absolutely freezing in the winter. Standing in those rooms and imagining my Eliza and the life she led really helped me craft a lot of the descriptions that made it into the choir about the conditions of the period. I want to talk now about the role that music plays in a novel because it really is central to everything. Choral singing had long been associated with church life in England, but in the second half of the 19th century, it exploded into the secular realm. Industrial prosperity, railway expansion, rising literacy all fed the growth of competitive music festivals. By the 1890s, mill workers and shop assistants were rehearsing in church halls after 12-hour shifts and traveling by rail to compete for trophies and cash prizes. Local newspapers devoted many columns to choral contests with the same seriousness we'd now give to sports results. Winning a choral competition brought honor not only to the choir itself, but to the whole town. A woman named Mary Wakefield was instrumental in launching the competitive music festival movement in England, and she actually makes a cameo appearance in the novel. I love slipping in real historical figures whenever I can. So, for working class women in particular, choir membership could be transformative. A woman might have no authority in her own home and no political voice, but in a choir, her voice was heard, literally. She contributed to something larger than herself. She was seen and she was valued. That's what the choir offers Eliza and the other women who she gets to join with her. At the beginning of the novel, Eliza is completely alone. She's walled herself off from others with no friends, and she keeps entirely to herself. Singing with a group of feisty, determined women gives her a purpose and a community she never expected to find. I think that resonates today just as much as it did back in the 1890s. Let's talk a moment about Ruth's world. So while Eliza is forming a choir and practicing to compete at a festival in Yorkshire, her childhood friend Ruth has made her way to a very different kind of stage. London in the 1890s was electric for theatrical entertainment. There was light opera, comic opera, operetta. The works of Gilbert and Sullivan were particularly popular. When the novel opens, Ruth is performing Yum Yum in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. Theater attracted every level of society: shop assistants, clerks, aristocrats, and even the Prince of Wales, who also has a cameo appearance in the novel. Ruth has everything that Eliza doesn't. She has visibility, she has applause, she has some financial independence, and she has glamour. But of course, things don't go well for Ruth, which of course they don't because this is a novel. Ruth's world comes crashing down, and she ends up becoming a judge in music competitions. And eventually, this is where her path will cross with Eliza. And they have a lot of unfinished business to resolve in order for them to truly both find their way. So, why does this novel really matter to me? Every novel I've written is about a woman who refuses to do what the world tells her. And The Choir is no different. This time it's more personal than my other novels because these people are real. My great great grandmother Eliza and my great grandmother, who is Bessie in the novel, and who I knew when I was a child, both have major roles. Their legacy of strong women passed down to my granny, who was a force to be reckoned with and who I knew for many, many decades of my life. She died when she was 98, and she was a wonderful force in my life. I was very grateful to have her. And then, of course, there is my mother. And unlike her mother, my mother was able to get an education. In fact, she got her PhD when she was 52, which was quite the accomplishment. She was and remains my inspiration. So history is not shaped only in parliament or palaces. It's shaped in kitchens, in factories, and in church halls by people whose stories we've largely lost. Writing The Choir was my way of giving some of these stories back. Now I'd like to do a reading from The Choir. This is from Chapter 1. Chapter 1, October 1897, Briarstown, East Yorkshire, Eliza. Eliza Kingwell slipped her hands into the wash-water to gather up her husband's 2 work shirts, taking pleasure in leaving them to the last, when the water was as dirty as it would get. Nervous excitement squeezed her chest as she kneaded and twisted. The nerves reminded her of how she used to feel singing for people who clapped and cheered and called for more. In exactly 3 weeks, Eliza would leave her home in this dreary wash-house forever. In the middle of the night, after Reg was gone to visit his sister in Leeds and all the snooping neighbors were tight asleep, Eliza would gather up the girls and go. She glanced over her shoulder to check she was alone in the wash-house, although she doubted anyone would come in so late in the day. The other women in the court did their washing and their gossiping in the morning when Eliza stayed away. She opened her mouth to let the delicious hum at the back of her throat escape into the frigid air. Amazing grace! How sweet the sound! She'd take the girls to the seaside when they got to Devon. When she'd lived there as a child, Dad and Ma could never afford to take her and her 3 brothers any farther than Exeter. That saved a wretch like me. She let her voice rise, imagining the sound filling her with the warmth of a summer sun. I was lost, but now I'm found. Scooping Reg's second shirt from the soap scum, she wrung it hard between her chapped palms and then hung it on the wooden rack. I was blind, but now I see. She held the final note for as long as possible before letting it fade to a whisper. Her eyes had been well and truly open now. So that is the opening of The Choir. You can find it on my website at www.carolcram.com. And if you do read it, I would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carol Cram, and this is the Art and Fiction Podcast.